The town of Redemption didn't speak in words. It spoke in the rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer. From the first blush of dawn until the sky bled into purple dusk, the steady metered blows from Elias Thorne's forge were the town's heartbeat. It was a sound of creation and repair in a land far more accustomed to taking and breaking, a constant reassurance that even in this harsh, unforgiving corner of the territory, things could be mended, made strong, made new. Elias Thorne himself was as silent as the quenching tub in which he plunged his white-hot steel. He was a large man, built not with the bulky, brutish muscle of a barroom brawler, but with the dense, functional power of a man who had spent a lifetime in labor. His shoulders were broad as an ox yoke, his arms corded with sinew that moved like thick rope beneath his soot-stained skin. But his eyes, a deep and quiet grey, held a sorrow so profound, so ancient, that the townsfolk respected it as they would a sleeping wolf best left undisturbed. For 10 years this had been his life. He had arrived on foot, leading a single mule, laden with the tools of his trade, and had taken over the long-abandoned forge at the edge of town. He never spoke of where he'd come from. He never asked questions. His answers to the rare queries directed at him were grunts, nods, or a shake of his head. Yet the town had come to understand his language. The sharp, declarative clang of the hammer meant work was being done. The softer, shaping taps meant a delicate repair was underway. The final resonant ring of a finished piece was a declaration of completion. They knew he was a good man. When little Timmy Gable, the storekeeper's son, broke the iron hoop, he loved to chase down the dusty street. His father told him it was gone for good. But Timmy, with a child's faith, brought the 2 bent pieces to the forge. Elias looked down at the boy, then at the broken toy. He wordlessly took the pieces, and while the boy watched with wide, hopeful eyes, he heated them in the glowing coals, laid them on the anvil, and with a series of impossibly gentle taps, welded them back together stronger than before. He cooled it, wiped it clean, and handed it back. When Mr. Gable came later to offer payment, Elias simply shook his head and turned back to his work. That was the language of Elias Thorne, a language of deeds, not words. This silent, steady centre of redemption began to tremble the day Sarah Vance arrived. She came on the afternoon stagecoach, a solitary figure stepping down into the swirling dust. She was a young woman with hair the colour of sun-cured wheat, pulled back in a simple but elegant knot, and she carried with her a spirit that seemed too bright, too vibrant for the weary, sun-bleached town. Her eyes, the colour of a summer sky, took everything in with an open curiosity that most settlers had lost long ago. She was the new schoolteacher hired by a town council that held a fragile hope that education might offer their children a future beyond the mine or the cattle trail. She took up residence in the small abandoned chapel next to Elias's forge. It was a derelict building with a leaning steeple and windows clouded with a decade of grime. But Sarah saw only potential. For a week, Elias watched her from the shadows of his forge. He saw her single-handedly sweep out the dust-wash the windows until they sparkled and arrange a handful of mismatched benches into neat rows. Soon, a new sound began to weave itself into the town's daily life, the clear, patient sound of Sarah's voice and the hesitant chorus of children reciting their letters. It was a fragile melody laid over the hammer's steady beat. Elias found himself timing his heaviest blows for when the children were outside for recess, so as not to startle them. He watched as Sarah taught the rowdy Miller boys who were more accustomed to brawling than books how to write their own names. He saw her coax a shy smile from little Mary Gable, who was afraid of her own shadow. He saw in Sarah the kind of unrelenting hope he thought had been scoured from the world, a hope he had personally buried 10 years prior. He never spoke to her, but their own silent conversation began. One morning, Sarah arrived to find the schoolhouse door latch, which had been loose and stubborn, was now firm and moved with a quiet, oiled grace. A few days later, a leg on the heavy reading bench the older boys used snapped clean off. She fretted about how she would fix it, but the next morning, a new leg perfectly carved from sturdy oak and smelling faintly of wood smoke was fitted in its place. Sarah knew there was only one man in town with that skill. That afternoon, after dismissing the children, she walked to the edge of the forge. She didn't enter, didn't dare intrude on his sanctuary. She simply placed a tin cup of fresh, cool water and a small, crusty loaf of bread from the baker on the edge of the great anvil. She said nothing and left. When Elias returned from banking his fire for the evening, he saw the offering. He looked toward the newly cleaned windows of the schoolhouse, then picked up the cup and drank the water a balm to his parched throat. The silent understanding had been sealed. It was shattered by the arrival of Silas Cain. He didn't ride into town on a dusty horse. He arrived in a polished black buggy drawn by two perfectly matched black horses. He wore a tailored suit of dark wool, a string tie and a hat that was clean of dust. He was a man of the East, a man of paper and law, and he carried himself with an air of predatory ownership. His smile, which he offered freely, never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He spent his first day at the land office, his voice a low, confident drone that carried out into the street. The whispers started soon after. He had papers, they said. Legal papers from a bankrupt railroad company back in St. Louis. He owned the titles, not to their homes, not yet, but to the unclaimed and derelict plots surrounding the town. This included the wide patch of land where the old chapel, now Sarah Vance's schoolhouse, stood. His first visit was to her. Elias was hammering a horseshoe, the rhythm automatic, when he saw the black buggy stop. His hammer faltered a missed beat that echoed in the sudden quiet. He watched as Cain stepped down and approached the schoolhouse. Sarah came to the door, wiping chalk dust from her hands. Cain stood before her, his large frame blocking the sun, his voice a low, condescending purr that Elias could hear even from his forge. He explained with feigned politeness that her charming little school was in fact on his property. He explained plans for the land, plans for a freight office, perhaps a saloon, more profitable ventures than teaching children to read. Sarah's spine stiffened. The town council gave me leave to use this building, Mr. Cain. It serves the children. The town council, Cain chuckled, does not own this land. I do. However, I am a reasonable man. He leaned in closer. I might be persuaded to lease it to you, for a fee, of course, a rather substantial fee. He paused, his eyes raking over her. Or perhaps we could come to another arrangement. A woman of your grace and intelligence must find it lonely out here. Sarah Vance, for all her brightness, was no fool. She understood the venom coiled beneath the honeyed words. Her face flushed, but her voice was steady. I will not be intimidated, sir. This school is for the good of the town. Cain's smile tightened into a thin, cruel line. Courage is a fool's currency in a town like this, little bird, he said, taking a step closer, invading her space. And my currency is the only one that matters here. Before he could take another step, a shadow fell over them both. Elias Thorne stood there. He hadn't made a sound as he crossed the street, his worn leather apron still tied around his waist, the heavy blacksmith's hammer held loosely in one powerful hand. He was bigger than Cain, broader, a man carved from granite and iron next to Cain's polished marble. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He just looked at Silas Cain, and in his quiet grey eyes was a stillness more absolute, more threatening than any spoken word. It was the stillness of a mountain before an avalanche. Cain's smirk wavered. He took in Elias's size, the silent intensity, the hammer. A flicker of confusion, then of cruel amusement crossed his face. He was a man who understood threats, but this silent, elemental presence was a language he didn't quite grasp. He straightened his coat, sneered, and tipped his hat to Sarah. "We will speak again," he said, then turned and walked away, his polished boots leaving sharp, clean prints in the dust. The town had seen. From the windows of the general store, from the doors of the saloons they had watched, and they had seen the silent blacksmith stand where no one else dared. The pressure from Cain intensified over the next week. It was a slow, suffocating poison. He called in an old shipping debt Mr. Gable, the storekeeper, owed, threatening to foreclose if he didn't triple the interest. He bought out the contract for the livery stable, doubling the price for farmers to board their horses. His two hired thugs, a pair of gaunt, sallow-faced men with dead eyes and guns tied low on their hips, began to loiter on street corners, their silent presence a constant, ugly reminder of Cain's power. Fear, thick and choking, settled over redemption once more, and the hopeful melody of the schoolhouse began to sound thin and reedy against it. Children stopped coming to school. The Miller boy's father worked for the livery and couldn't risk Cain's anger. Little Mary Gable was kept home, her father too terrified to draw any more attention to his family. The schoolhouse grew quiet. Sarah did not give up. She tried to thank Elias, but words felt clumsy and inadequate in the face of his profound silence. One evening, after the last of her few remaining pupils had gone home, she found him standing in the fading light, staring into the dying embers of his forge. The powerful set of his shoulders was slumped as if carrying a weight far heavier than any anvil. She stood quietly in the doorway for a long moment, gathering her courage. "They say you haven't spoken more than a dozen words in 10 years, she said softly. Her voice didn't startle him. It was as if he had been waiting for it. He didn't turn. "I don't believe that a man's past defines him." She continued stepping just inside the forge, the smell of coal smoke and hot metal filling her senses. "I believe he is defined by the choices he makes every day. You choose to fix what is broken. You choose to be kind. Whatever happened to you, it doesn't have to be who you are forever. Your hammer, it doesn't just fix things, Mr. Thorne. It builds them. It reminds people that things can be made whole again." He finally turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was so full of raw ancient pain that it stole her breath. It was the look of a man who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. He opened his mouth, his lips parting as if to shape a word, a sound, a confession. But before he could, Silas Cain's voice, sharp and triumphant, cut through the evening air. Thorne, I knew it. I knew I recognized you. Cain stood in the street, illuminated by the setting sun, flanked by his two thugs. He was beaming a man who had just solved a puzzle that had been vexing him. It took me a while, Cain crowed, walking closer. The beard, the silence, very clever. A blacksmith perfect. But I never forget a face, especially the face of the man who hunted my brother. Sarah looked at Elias, her brow furrowed in confusion. But Elias's body had gone rigid, his hands clenched into fists so tight the knuckles were white as bone. He looked like a statue carved from anguish. The good people of redemption don't know who their silent hero is, do they? Cain taunted, his voice dripping with venom for the gathering crowd of onlookers. They don't know they're being protected by United States Marshal Elias Thorne, or as they used to call you back in the territories, the ghost of the Panhandle. The man whose gun was faster than rumour, who never brought a man back alive. A collective gasp rippled through the townsfolk. The silent, gentle blacksmith was a legendary, hardened lawman, a killer. I wonder, Cain continued, his voice turning soft and intimate, a blade meant only for Elias. Do you still hear the gunshots from that day in Willow Creek? The day my brother's gang decided to pay you a personal visit. I heard your wife was a beautiful woman. Anna, wasn't it? And your boy, what was his name, Daniel? Did he cry for you, Marshal, before the end? A single ragged breath escaped Elias's lips. The world around him dissolved. The forge, the town, Sarah's shocked face, it all melted away into the blistering heat and choking dust of another day 10 years ago. He was in Willow Creek. He could smell the gunpowder and the fear. He saw his wife Anna, her arms outstretched, as she tried to shield their son. He saw her fall. He heard the sound of his own colt, a roaring, bucking beast in his hand that he could no longer control, a storm of righteous fury and absolute despair. And through it all, the phantom echo of his 6-year-old son's laughter, a sound he had cherished above all others, silenced forever by a stray bullet in the chaos. He had hunted down every last man in that gang, but it hadn't brought his family back. It had only hollowed him out further. On the day he cornered the last one, he had looked at his gun, then at his empty life. He had unbuckled his gun belt, dropped it in the dust and walked away. He had walked until his boots fell apart, until the name Marshal Thorne was a ghost that belonged to another man. He came to redemption to bury that ghost. His silence was his penance. His forge was his atonement. And now Silas Cain had dug up the grave and paraded the corpse through the centre of town. The days that followed were a new kind of silent hell. The townsfolk now looked at Elias with fear. They saw not the gentle craftsman, but the legendary killer. The rhythm of his hammer no longer sounded like a heartbeat. It sounded like a threat. Mr. Gable hurried his son past the forge. The few remaining children were pulled from school. Sarah was completely alone, her schoolhouse now, an island of hope in a sea of renewed terror. The town had chosen fear over faith. She was the only one who didn't abandon him. 2 days after the revelation, she walked to the forge in the late afternoon. Elias was not working. He was just sitting on an old crate staring at a cold anvil. He looked like a mountain that had crumbled from within. "They are afraid of the ghost, Elias," she said, using his first name for the first time. "They aren't seeing the man." He didn't look at her. "The ghost is the man." He rasped the words, sounding like rocks scraping together. No, she said, stepping closer. The ghost is the one who used a gun. The man is the one who uses a hammer. The ghost took lives. The man mends them. I don't care who you were. I know who you are. And that is the man this town needs. She left a covered plate of food on a workbench and departed, leaving him alone with her words. The final confrontation came at dawn the next day. Cain, frustrated by the stalemate and emboldened by the town's fear, decided to end it. He marched to the schoolhouse with his 2 thugs, a lit torch held high in his hand. A town that has no future doesn't need a school, he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty street. And you, Thorne, can watch it all burn again. But as he approached the dry wooden steps of the chapel, the great doors of the forge swung open. Elias Thorne stepped out into the grey morning light. He was not wearing a gun belt. His hands were empty. He walked slowly, deliberately into the middle of the street, his eyes fixed on Cain. You want the man I was? Elias's voice was a raw, powerful thing torn from his throat after years of disuse, but clear and steady. He's dead. He died with his family in Willow Creek. Then you'll die here with this town, Cain snarled, raising the torch. No, Elias said. He turned not in retreat but with purpose and walked back into the dark maw of his forge. For a moment it looked like surrender. Cain laughed a harsh, ugly sound. But then Elias emerged again. In his hand he held not a gun but his blacksmith's hammer, the tool of his penance, the instrument of his redemption. It was heavy-balanced, an extension of his own arm. Its polished face, worn smooth from a decade of creation, gleamed in the rising sun. He walked toward Cain, his steps as steady and metered as the beat of his forge. It was not the quick, nervous walk of a gunslinger, but the powerful, grounded stride of a builder. Cain's men drew their guns, but Elias's speed was not of the hand, but of the whole body. Before they could fire, he was on them. The hammer was a blur of dark steel. It was not a weapon of death, but of sheer disabling force. A carefully aimed strike to a wrist shattered a gunman's aim, sending his pistol flying. A heavy glancing blow to a shoulder sent the other man spinning into a horse trough. The fight was over in seconds. Cain stood alone, his bravado gone, the torch dropped and sputtering in the dust. He stared at Elias, who stood over him, hammer raised, breathing heavily. For one terrifying second, the old ghost, the vengeful, deadly marshal, looked out from Elias's eyes. The desire for a final finishing blow was a palpable thing. But then he looked past Cain at Sarah, who stood on the schoolhouse porch. Her face was not filled with fear of him, but with unwavering faith. He saw in her eyes the reflection of the man he had been trying to become for 10 years. The ghost receded. He lowered the hammer. "No more," he said, his voice clear and final. He turned to the townspeople who were now cautiously emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. He looked at Mr. Gable, at the sheriff, at all the familiar faces. "Justice is your choice now, not mine." He let the heavy hammer fall from his hand, its thud in the dust a sound of punctuation. A period at the end of a long, dark chapter. Then he turned and walked back to his forge, the weight of a decade finally blessedly lifting from his shoulders. Weeks later, Redemption was a different town. Cain and his men trussed up and delivered by a suddenly courageous sheriff, and a posse of citizens were gone on their way to face a territorial judge. The fear that had choked the town had dissipated, replaced by a quiet, resilient pride. The schoolhouse was full again, and the sound of children's laughter was louder than ever. And at the forge, the rhythm of the hammer continued. But it was different now, lighter somehow, more hopeful. One afternoon, Sarah brought a glass of cool water to Elias as he worked. He stopped, took the glass from her hand, and drank deeply. He looked at her, at the town that was healing, at the future she represented, a future he had fought for, not with a ghost's vengeance, but with a blacksmith's strength. And for the first time in 10 years, Elias Thorne smiled. It was a small, quiet thing, hesitant at first, like a flower pushing through hard-packed earth. But it was real, and it was as strong and true as the steel he forged. His silence was broken not by a cry of vengeance from the past, but by the unspoken promise of a future he was finally ready to build.